Most people believe that psychological collapse is something to avoid at all costs. A failure, a malfunction, a sign that something has gone terribly wrong. Carl Jung saw it very differently. He believed that some breakdowns are not accidents at all, but necessary turning points in the life of the psyche. Moments when the unconscious forces its way into consciousness because the life you are living is no longer true. These moments do not arrive with fireworks or clear explanations. They arrive quietly. Suddenly, your goals feel hollow. Your relationships lose their meaning. The ambitions that once drove you forward now feel strangely borrowed, as if they belong to someone else. This is not depression in the ordinary sense. This is the beginning of individuation. Jung described this process as a confrontation with the self, a moment when the persona begins to crack. The persona is the social mask you build to survive, to be accepted, to belong. It is not fake, but it is incomplete. When you live too long inside it, the psyche demands a correction. What follows often feels like a collapse, but it is actually an initiation. Jung spoke of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that appear during these periods as if life itself were signaling that something deeper is unfolding. Old structures dissolve, certainties vanish. You are left in a strange psychological no man's land where the old identity no longer works, and the new one has not yet formed. This stage is terrifying because it removes external validation. You can no longer rely on roles, titles, or expectations to tell you who you are. The ego experiences this as a kind of death, and in a very real sense, it is. Jung insisted that no genuine transformation occurs without this symbolic death. The psyche must shed what is false in order to give birth to something real. Most people run from this moment. They try to rebuild the old life, restore the mask, return to comfort. Individuation begins only when you stay, when you stop trying to fix the collapse and start listening to it. This is the threshold where the borrowed life ends and the authentic one begins. After the collapse of the persona comes the encounter most people fear the most. Jung called it the shadow. These are the parts of yourself you learn to reject in order to be accepted: anger, envy, weakness, desire, fear. They do not disappear when ignored. They wait. And when the persona breaks, they emerge with force. The shadow is not evil, it is unfinished. Everything you were told was unacceptable was pushed into it. Jung warned that the shadow grows stronger the longer it is denied. What we refuse to face internally eventually controls us externally. This is why moral certainty often hides deep inner conflict. Meeting the shadow feels destabilizing because it contradicts the image you had of yourself. You may realize that your kindness was fear of conflict. Your discipline was fear of chaos. Your morality was fear of rejection. Individuation demands honesty, not purity. This stage often feels like regression. Old emotions resurface. Forgotten impulses return. Jung insisted this is not going backward, but downward. Like roots growing deeper into the soil. Without this descent, no stable growth is possible. Many people stop here. They confuse discomfort with danger and retreat to old identities. Jung observed that neurosis often begins at this point, when the psyche calls for growth and the ego refuses to listen. To integrate the shadow is not to act it out, but to understand it. Awareness transforms raw impulse into choice. This is where psychological maturity begins. Not by becoming better, but by becoming whole. Integration begins when you stop fighting what you find inside yourself. Jung explained that the shadow loses its destructive power the moment it is seen clearly. What was once feared becomes information. What was once denied becomes energy. The psyche does not want perfection. It wants balance. This stage feels quieter than crisis, but more demanding. There is no dramatic collapse anymore. Instead, there is responsibility. You can no longer blame the world for what lives inside you. Individuation requires ownership of your reactions, thoughts, and impulses. As integration deepens, something unexpected happens. You stop needing approval. Jung noted that the individuated person becomes less interesting socially, but more real internally. You no longer perform identity, you inhabit it. This is often where relationships change. Some people fall away, others feel uncomfortable around your clarity. Jung warned that individuation is not a collective process. It separates before it unites. Individuation does not make you superior. It makes you grounded. You stop projecting your shadow onto others. Enemies lose their power. Jung said that what irritates us in others reveals what we have not integrated in ourselves. At this point, the true self begins to emerge, not as an image, but as presence. Less ambition, less fear, more coherence. Jung described this as living from the center rather than the mask. Life stops being performance and becomes expression. After individuation begins a quieter phase that many misunderstand. There is no constant revelation, no emotional fireworks. Jung warned that people often mistake this calm for emptiness. In reality, it is stability. The psyche no longer needs to scream to be heard. One of the greatest dangers at this stage is spiritual ego, the belief that awareness makes you superior. Jung warned that consciousness without humility becomes another mask. True individuation does not inflate identity, it dissolves it. The individuated person no longer seeks to convince others. There is no mission to awaken the world. Jung emphasized that forcing insight onto others is violence in subtle form. Truth matures in silence. Life becomes simpler, but not easier. You feel responsibility more sharply because you can no longer hide behind excuses. Individuation removes the comfort of unconsciousness. Freedom demands discipline. Relationships at this stage are fewer, but clearer. You stop needing intensity to feel alive. Drama loses its attraction. Jung wrote that neurosis feeds on conflict. Integration feeds on clarity. Individuation does not end suffering. It ends self-betrayal. Pain may remain, but it no longer fragments you. Jung described this as alignment between inner truth and outer life. You stop acting against yourself. At the final stage, individuation stops feeling like a process and starts feeling like a way of being. There is no finish line, no permanent certainty. Jung emphasized that wholeness is dynamic. You remain open, adaptive, and aware that regression is always possible. You stop asking who you should become. The question shifts to how honestly you can live. Jung warned that chasing identity creates fragmentation. Integration begins when identity loosens its grip. Fear does not disappear. It loses authority. Decisions are no longer driven by avoidance, but by alignment. Jung believed courage was not absence of fear, but refusal to be ruled by it. The individuated person becomes harder to manipulate. Not because they are defensive, but because they are clear. Confusion is the gateway of control. Clarity closes it. Loneliness changes meaning. It is no longer abandonment, but space. Jung wrote that solitude is where the psyche reorganizes itself. Without solitude, individuation cannot stabilize. Individuation does not promise happiness. It offers coherence. You may lose people, roles, and illusions. What remains is something quieter but unbreakable. A life that no longer needs approval to exist.